Full story. She burst into the Alpha King's wedding. He stopped the vows and said, "I've been waiting." She burst into the Alpha King's wedding. He stopped the vows and said, "I've been waiting." Nobody invited Nadia to the wedding. That was the point. That had always been the point. She was 26 years old, living in a small apartment in Portland, working a bookkeeping job for a furniture company, and doing her very best to stay out of everyone's way. She didn't go to pack gatherings. She didn't attend ceremonies. She didn't push herself into spaces where she clearly wasn't wanted. She had learned that lesson early, the hard way, the way most people learn things that really stick. The Voss family had never quite known what to do with her. Her mother had been a half-blood, an outsider who had fallen in love with a Voss man, and then left when Nadia was 3 years old. Her father had remarried quickly and built a new, cleaner life. Nadia had grown up on the edges of that life, present enough to be seen, ignored enough to feel invisible. And the thing that made it worse, the thing that quietly defined her in every room she walked into, was that her wolf had never woken up. At 26, she had never shifted, never felt the pull, never experienced what every other person in her bloodline had felt by the time they were teenagers. The elders said it sometimes happened with half-bloods. They said it like it wasn't a big deal. But everyone treated it like it was. So when her cousin Celeste got engaged to Alpha King Alaric Devereaux, Nadia was not on the guest list. She found out through a group message that was forwarded to her by mistake. She read the details. The date, the estate in Montana, the names, and she put her phone face down on her desk and went back to her spreadsheets. She told herself she didn't care. She was good at telling herself that. But 3 nights before the wedding, something happened that she could not explain. She woke up at 2 in the morning with her heart pounding, not from a nightmare. She hadn't been dreaming at all. She sat up in the dark and just felt it. A pull. A deep, wordless, almost physical tug somewhere in the center of her chest, like a rope attached to something far away had suddenly gone taut. She pressed her hand to her sternum and sat there for a long time, breathing, waiting for it to go away. It didn't go away. It got stronger over the next 2 days, quiet in the mornings, and almost unbearable by night. She couldn't eat properly. She couldn't focus. She kept standing at her window and looking north like she was waiting for something. On the morning of the wedding, she packed a bag. She didn't make a plan. She didn't call anyone. She got in her car, pulled onto the highway, and started driving toward Montana. She told herself she would turn around in an hour. She told herself that at every exit for the next 14 hours, and she never turned around once. She arrived at the Voss estate just after 4 in the afternoon. The ceremony had already started. She could hear music coming from inside the hall, soft, ceremonial, the kind of music that signals something important is about to become permanent. There were cars everywhere, catering vans, a floral delivery truck that had somehow stayed past its window. 2 guards stood at the garden gate, and they stopped her immediately. She didn't have an invitation. She didn't have a reason they would accept. She said she was family, which was technically true, but didn't move them at all. Inside the hall, 300 guests sat in neat rows, facing an altar covered in white roses. Celeste stood at the front in a dress that had taken 4 months to make. She was beautiful in the way that felt intentional. Composed, radiant, everything a future Alpha Queen was expected to be. And standing across from her, close enough to take her hands, was Alaric Devereaux. He was not what most people imagined when they thought of an Alpha King. He wasn't loud. He didn't fill a room with noise or performance. He filled it with weight, the kind of presence that made people instinctively lower their voices. He was 31, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that stayed very still when he was thinking. He had been standing at that altar for 11 minutes. And in those 11 minutes, not one person in the room could have told you what expression was on his face. He gave nothing away. He never did. The officiant had just asked the guests if anyone had reason to object when the commotion started at the back of the hall. The doors opened harder than they were meant to. One of them swung wide and hit the wall. And Nadia, still in the clothes she had been driving in for 14 hours, hair loose, completely out of breath from arguing with the guards, stumbled into the doorway and grabbed the frame to steady herself. Every head in the room turned. And then something strange happened. Every wolf in that hall, and there were many, went quiet at exactly the same moment. Not the polite quiet of guests reacting to an interruption. Something older than that. An instinctive stillness, like every animal in a field when the wind changes. Alaric turned his head. He looked at Nadia. Just looked at her. And something in his face, for the first time that anyone could remember, changed. Celeste was still holding the bouquet. The officiant was still holding his book. His second in command, a man named Wren who stood to the left of the altar, took a small step forward. Nobody spoke. The music had stopped. The only sound was the faint creak of the hall settling and Nadia's unsteady breathing from the doorway. Alaric raised one hand, not toward Celeste, not toward the officiant, just up, slowly, like a signal, and said, "Stop." The officiant stopped. He stepped off the altar. He walked down the aisle. He did not look at anyone else in the room. He walked all the way to the back of the hall, all the way to where Nadia was still gripping the doorframe, and he stopped in front of her. She looked terrible, honestly. She was pale from the drive. There were faint shadows under her eyes. She smelled like gas station coffee and road dust, and something underneath that, something that made Wren, watching from the altar, go very still with recognition. Alaric looked at her for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he said, quietly, "Not for the room, not for the 300 people sitting with their mouths open, just for her. I've been waiting. I didn't know your face, but I knew you were coming." Nadia stared at him. She had no words. She had driven 14 hours on a feeling she couldn't explain, pushed past guards, interrupted a royal wedding, and made an absolute disaster of a day that had been planned for months. And now the most powerful man in the room was standing in front of her, telling her he'd been waiting for her. She felt it then, for the first time in her life, the first time in 26 years, something stirred deep inside her. Not pain, not fear. Something waking up. Something that had been sleeping so long it didn't know how to open its eyes all at once. Her wolf. Finally, quietly, unmistakably, beginning to wake. Behind them, the room had started to come apart. Celeste's father was on his feet. Two elders were speaking in low, urgent tones to each other. Wren had moved to Alaric's side and was saying something in a voice too quiet for most guests to hear, but his expression said everything. He was not surprised. He was confirming something he had already begun to suspect the moment Nadia walked through the door. Celeste did not move for a long time. She stood at the altar with her bouquet and her 4-month dress and her 300 witnesses, and she was very, very still. The attendants on either side of her didn't know whether to touch her arm or step back. She wasn't crying. That was the thing people would talk about later. She wasn't crying at all. She was thinking. Anyone who knew Celeste Voss well enough could see it in her jaw. She was already deciding what came next for her. Pack law, as Wren explained to the elders within the hour, was clear on one thing. A recognized bond between an alpha and his true mate could not be overridden by a political ceremony. The bond was not something that could be chosen or unchosen. It was not a feeling or a preference. It was a fact of their nature, older than any agreement between families. The ceremony was, by every legal standard they held, void. The reception hall that had been set for a wedding dinner became, instead, the site of the longest and most uncomfortable negotiation the Voss family had held in a generation. Through all of it, Nadia sat in a small room off the main corridor, with a glass of water she hadn't touched, trying to understand what had just happened to her life. A woman she barely knew brought her a cardigan. Someone else brought her a plate of food. She didn't eat that either. She sat with her hands in her lap and tried to feel the thing that had woken up inside her. And it was still there, still moving, slow and uncertain, like something learning how to breathe. Alaric came to find her when the first wave of noise had settled. He sat down across from her. Not close, not formal, just present. He didn't launch into an explanation. He didn't apologize, because there was nothing either of them had done wrong. He simply looked at her the way he had looked at her in the doorway, and he asked her one question. "Will you stay?" Nadia looked at this man she had met an hour ago. This man who had ended his own wedding for her without hesitation, who said he had been waiting for someone he didn't know, who had walked down an aisle in front of 300 people and chosen a woman who smelled like road dust and gas station coffee over everything that had been planned and promised and arranged. She thought about her apartment in Portland, her spreadsheets, her quiet, careful, small life that she had built specifically so that nobody could exclude her from it, because she had made it small enough that there was nothing to be excluded from. She looked at him and said, I don't know yet, but I didn't drive 14 hours to leave. It wasn't a love story yet. It was something more honest than that. Two people at the beginning of something neither of them fully understood, in a room full of consequences, choosing to stay still long enough to find out what it was. And that, if you ask anyone who was there that day, was the moment the real story started.